The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as hundreds of mourners gathered for what appeared to be just another military funeral. Most of the attendees wore crisp uniforms decorated with ribbons and medals, their faces solemn as they paid respects to a fallen soldier. Among them stood a small, elderly woman in a simple black dress, her gray hair neatly pinned back, clutching a worn leather purse. Margaret Chun had arrived early that Tuesday morning, taking the metro from her tiny apartment in downtown Washington. At 78 years old, she moved slowly but with purpose, her weathered hands gripping a small bouquet of white chrysanthemums she had bought from a street vendor. The flowers cost her $12, money she could barely spare from her monthly Social Security check, but she felt compelled to bring something. As the ceremony began, Margaret positioned herself at the back of the crowd, almost hidden behind a large oak tree. She watched as distinguished generals and decorated officers stepped forward to speak about the deceased, a young sergeant who had died in Afghanistan. Their words echoed across the pristine rows of white headstones, speaking of honor, duty, and sacrifice. But Margaret noticed something that made her heart ache. Despite all the formal ceremony and official recognition, there was a profound sadness in the eyes of the sergeant's young widow. The woman, barely 25, stood with two small children clinging to her legs, her face a mask of grief and uncertainty. Margaret recognized that look. It was the same expression she had worn decades earlier, when she too had stood at a military funeral, overlooked and forgotten by those who should have known her importance. The chaplain's voice carried across the cemetery as he spoke about the sergeant's service, his bravery, and the ultimate sacrifice he made for his country. Family members wiped away tears, and fellow soldiers stood at rigid attention. Margaret found herself thinking about her own husband, David, who had died in Vietnam 52 years ago. His funeral had been much smaller, attended only by a handful of family members and a military representative who barely knew his name. After the formal ceremony concluded, most of the attendees began to disperse. The widow lingered by the gravesite, her children growing restless in the afternoon heat. Margaret watched as officers approached to offer their condolences, their words brief and formal before they too departed for their waiting cars. Something stirred within Margaret as she observed the scene. The widow looked so alone, so lost among all the military protocol and formal gestures. Margaret remembered that feeling of isolation, of being the person left behind while others moved on with their lives. She had promised herself long ago that if she ever had the chance, she would reach out to another military widow who might be experiencing that same overwhelming loneliness. Summoning her courage, Margaret walked slowly toward the gravesite. The widow looked up as she approached, her eyes red from crying. Margaret's voice was soft and gentle as she introduced herself, explaining that she too had lost a husband in military service. The conversation that followed was brief but meaningful, two women connected by shared loss and the unique challenges of military widowhood. As they spoke, Margaret noticed a tall figure in a dress uniform standing at a distance, observing their interaction with interest. The man appeared to be in his 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He wore the eagles of a full colonel, and his chest displayed an impressive array of ribbons and decorations. Something about his intent gaze made Margaret feel slightly uncomfortable, as if he was studying her with unusual interest. The colonel remained at his respectful distance until the widow and her children finally departed with other family members. Only then did he approach Margaret, who was placing her small bouquet among the larger, more elaborate floral arrangements. His footsteps on the grass were measured and deliberate, the sound of someone who had spent decades in military service. Margaret looked up as a shadow fell across her, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun to see his face more clearly. There was something familiar about his features, though she could not immediately place where she might have seen him before. His expression was serious, but not unkind, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of command, tempered by what seemed like genuine curiosity. The colonel's first words were simple, but loaded with implication. He asked if she was Margaret Shun, and when she nodded uncertainly, he requested a moment of her time. Something in his tone suggested this was not a casual encounter, that he had sought her out specifically. Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness, wondering if she had somehow violated cemetery protocol or if there was some issue with her presence at the funeral. As other mourners continued to leave the area, Margaret found herself alone with this distinguished officer who seemed to know her name. The afternoon was growing warm, and she felt slightly overwhelmed by the emotion of the day, combined with this unexpected encounter. She agreed to speak with him, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty about what this conversation might reveal. The colonel's next words would change everything Margaret thought she knew about her place in military history. But in that moment, she simply waited with the patience of someone who had learned through decades of experience that life could bring unexpected revelations when you least expected them. Colonel James Morrison had spent the better part of 3 months trying to locate Margaret Shun. His search had begun with dusty military records stored in Pentagon archives, continued through Veteran Affairs databases, and, finally, led him to cross-reference obituaries and census records. When he discovered she was still alive and living in Washington, he made it his mission to find an appropriate opportunity to approach her. The funeral of Sergeant Rodriguez had provided that opportunity. As the base commander at Fort Belvoir, Morrison had known the young soldier personally, and his attendance at the funeral was both official duty and personal respect. But his primary reason for being there was to finally meet the woman whose story had consumed his thoughts for months. Margaret studied the colonel's weathered face, noting the intensity in his gray eyes. When he asked if she had been married to Sergeant David Shun, who served in the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam, her heart began to race. Very few people knew details about David's service, and even fewer cared to remember after all these decades. She nodded slowly, wondering where this conversation was leading. Morrison reached into his uniform jacket and withdrew a manila folder that looked official and well-handled. Inside were photocopied documents, some bearing the seals of various military departments. As he opened the folder, Margaret caught glimpses of her husband's name typed on several pages, along with dates and locations that brought back painful memories of his final deployment. The colonel's voice was respectful as he began to explain his presence. Several months earlier, he had been tasked with reviewing historical military records as part of a Pentagon initiative to identify overlooked acts of heroism. The project aimed to correct historical oversights and ensure that deserving service members received proper recognition, even if that recognition came decades late. David Chin's file had been among thousands reviewed, but something about his case had caught Morrison's attention. The official record showed that Sergeant Shun had died in combat during a routine patrol, but additional documents told a different story. Witness statements, after-action reports, and classified communications painted a picture of extraordinary bravery that had never been properly acknowledged. Margaret listened with growing amazement as Morrison described events from February 1972 that she had never fully understood. According to the military reports, David's unit had been ambushed while conducting a reconnaissance mission near the Cambodian border. What the official casualty reports had failed to mention was that David had single-handedly covered his squad's retreat, allowing 12 other soldiers to reach safety. The details were difficult for Margaret to hear, but Morrison continued with professional compassion. Multiple witnesses had reported that David had remained in an exposed position, drawing enemy fire while his comrades escaped. He had maintained his position even after being wounded, continuing to provide covering fire until his ammunition was exhausted. His actions had saved the lives of every other member of his unit. Morrison explained that in the chaos of war and the military bureaucracy of the early 1970s, David's heroic actions had been documented, but never properly processed for recognition. The witnesses had been transferred to different units. The commanding officer had been killed in a subsequent engagement, and the paperwork had been misfiled in the massive military administration system. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes as she learned details about her husband's final moments that she had never known. For 52 years, she had believed that David had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, another casualty of an unpopular war. The knowledge that his death had saved the lives of 12 other soldiers transformed her understanding of his sacrifice. The colonel continued, explaining that his research had uncovered similar cases of overlooked heroism. But David's case was particularly compelling because of the clear documentation and multiple witness accounts. Morrison had spent weeks tracking down surviving members of David's unit, now elderly men scattered across the country, and their stories were consistent and powerful. One of those witnesses, Morrison revealed, was now a retired general living in California. General Patricia Williams, formerly Corporal Williams, had been a medic with David's unit. She had provided a detailed written statement describing David's actions and expressing her lifelong gratitude for his sacrifice. Williams had tried for years to have David's heroism officially recognized, but had been frustrated by military bureaucracy and changing personnel. As Morrison spoke, Margaret began to understand why this distinguished colonel had sought her out in a cemetery. This was not just about correcting historical records or satisfying military bureaucrats. This was about honoring a man whose sacrifice had been forgotten by the system he had served, and about recognizing the widow who had carried the weight of that loss alone for over 5 decades. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting longer shadows across the cemetery, but neither Margaret nor Morrison seemed aware of the passing time. For Margaret, this conversation was rewriting the story of her husband's death and her own decades of quiet grief. For Morrison, this was the culmination of months of detective work and a chance to right a historical wrong. Morrison's next words would reveal the true purpose of his search and offer Margaret something she had never dared to imagine possible. But in this moment, she simply absorbed the magnitude of what she was learning about the man she had loved and lost so many years ago. Margaret's hands trembled as she held the folder Colonel Morrison had given her. Inside were testimonies from men who had served with David, official military communications, and maps marking the location where her husband had made his final stand. Reading their words after so many years felt like receiving letters from the dead, messages that had somehow traveled across 5 decades to reach her. The first testimony was from Master Sergeant Robert Hayes, now 74 and living in Oregon. His handwritten statement described David as the bravest soldier I served with in 2 tours of Vietnam. Hayes wrote about how David had volunteered for dangerous missions, always putting his fellow soldiers before his own safety. Most importantly, Hayes described in detail the events of February 18, 1972, when David's heroic actions had saved Hayes's life along with 11 others. Another statement came from former specialist Marcus Thompson, who had been just 19 years old during that fateful patrol. Thompson's account was particularly moving, describing how David had pushed him into cover just seconds before enemy fire erupted around them. Thompson wrote that he had become a teacher after the war, inspired by David's selfless example, and had spent 40 years wondering why the man who saved his life had never received proper recognition. As Margaret read these testimonies, she began to understand the true scope of what Morrison had uncovered. This was not just about one overlooked hero, but about a systematic failure to honor the sacrifices of soldiers whose actions have been witnessed and documented but somehow lost in bureaucratic shuffles. David's case had become a symbol of a larger injustice that Morrison was determined to address. The colonel explained that his investigation had revealed similar cases throughout military history, particularly among minority soldiers whose heroic actions had been overlooked or minimized. David's Chinese-American heritage, Morrison suggested, might have contributed to the lack of attention his case had received during an era when racial prejudice was more openly tolerated in military institutions. Margaret thought about her own experiences as a young military widow in the 1970s. She remembered the condescending attitudes of some military officials, the assumption that she would quickly remarry and forget about David's service. As an Asian American woman, she had often felt invisible in military communities that were predominantly white and male. Perhaps that invisibility had extended to her husband's sacrifice as well. Morrison's research had also uncovered correspondence between David's commanding officers and higher-ranking officials, discussing potential awards and recognition for David's actions. These discussions had apparently continued for several weeks after David's death, but the paperwork had been interrupted by the unit's redeployment and subsequent casualties among the officers involved. The colonel opened another section of the folder, revealing official military photographs from David's unit. Margaret gasped when she saw a picture of David with his squad, taken just days before his death. She had never seen this photograph, and seeing her young husband's face smiling among his comrades brought fresh tears to her eyes. He looked so young, so full of life, unaware that his death would save the lives of the men standing beside him. Morrison explained that his investigation had also led him to discover Margaret's own story. After David's death, she had worked as a seamstress in a factory, raising their infant daughter alone while struggling with grief and financial hardship. She had never remarried, dedicating her life to preserving David's memory and raising their child to understand the importance of service and sacrifice. The colonel had learned that Margaret had volunteered for decades with veteran organizations, quietly helping other military widows navigate the complex bureaucracy of survivor benefits and support services. She had never sought recognition for this work, viewing it simply as her way of honoring David's memory and helping others who face similar challenges. Margaret was stunned to learn that Morrison knew so much about her life. She had always assumed that her small contributions to the veteran community had gone unnoticed, that she was just another elderly woman doing what she could to help. The idea that a colonel had researched her personal history as thoroughly as he had investigated David's military service was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. Morrison's tone became more formal as he shifted to the true purpose of their meeting. The Department of Defense, he explained, was prepared to posthumously award David the Silver Star for his heroic actions in Vietnam. The award would be presented in a formal ceremony at the Pentagon, attended by military leadership and the surviving members of David's unit who could travel to Washington. But Morrison's revelation went beyond just the Silver Star. The military was also prepared to acknowledge the decades of oversight that had allowed David's heroism to go unrecognized. This acknowledgement would include a formal apology from the Secretary of Defense and a commitment to review other potentially overlooked cases from the Vietnam era. The colonel paused, allowing Margaret to absorb the magnitude of what he was telling her. After more than 50 years of believing that David's death was simply a tragic casualty of war, she was learning that he had died as a hero whose actions had saved the lives of 12 fellow soldiers. Moreover, his sacrifice would finally receive the recognition it deserved, even if that recognition came far too late. Margaret felt overwhelmed by a mixture of emotions. Grief for all the years that David's heroism had gone unacknowledged, gratitude toward Morrison and the others who had worked to uncover the truth, and a deep sense of vindication for her decades of faith in her husband's character. She had always known that David was a good man and a dedicated soldier, but she had never imagined the full extent of his final act of courage. As the cemetery grew quiet around them, Margaret realized that this encounter was changing not only how she understood her husband's death, but also how she saw her own place in military history. For decades, she had been just another forgotten widow, but Morrison's investigation had revealed that her own story of resilience and service was part of a larger narrative about sacrifice and recognition that deserved to be told. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in the corridors of the Pentagon, feeling small and overwhelmed in the massive building that represented the heart of American military power. She wore her best dress, a navy blue outfit she had purchased specifically for this occasion, and carried a small purse containing the few photographs of David she had managed to preserve over the decades. Colonel Morrison had arranged for Margaret to tour the Pentagon before the ceremony, explaining that he wanted her to understand the significance of the setting where David would finally receive his recognition. As they walked through the halls lined with portraits of military leaders and displays of military history, Margaret reflected on how different this experience was from David's original funeral. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, a space reserved for the most significant military recognition events. Morrison had explained that this location was chosen specifically to emphasize the importance of David's belated recognition and to ensure that his story would be preserved as part of official military history. Margaret was introduced to several high-ranking officials who had participated in the investigation of David's case. General Patricia Williams, the former medic who had served with David, had flown in from California specifically for the ceremony. Now 71 years old, Williams embraced Margaret with tears in her eyes, expressing decades of gratitude for David's sacrifice and regret that this recognition had taken so long. Williams shared stories about David that Margaret had never heard, describing his kindness toward younger soldiers and his reputation for volunteering for dangerous missions to protect his comrades. These personal anecdotes helped Margaret understand why David's fellow soldiers had fought so hard over the years to have his heroism recognized, even when their efforts were frustrated by military bureaucracy. Other surviving members of David's unit had also traveled to Washington for the ceremony. Robert Hayes, the master sergeant whose testimony had been crucial to Morrison's investigation, explained how David's sacrifice had shaped his entire post-war life. Hayes had become a veteran counselor, dedicating his career to helping other soldiers process their combat experiences and transition to civilian life. Marcus Thompson, the former specialist who had been saved by David's actions, brought his own children and grandchildren to the ceremony. He introduced them to Margaret as the wife of the man who saved my life, explaining that his entire family existed because of David's heroism. Thompson's youngest granddaughter, a 10-year-old girl named Sarah, presented Margaret with a handmade card thanking David for his sacrifice. As Margaret met these families and heard their stories, she began to understand the ripple effects of David's final act. His split-second decision to provide covering fire had not only saved 12 lives in 1972, but had allowed those men to return home, raise families, and contribute to their communities for the past 50 years. David's sacrifice had created a legacy that extended far beyond what he could have imagined. The formal ceremony began with military precision. Secretary of Defense Robert Chun, no relation to David, presided over the event, flanked by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other senior military leaders. The hall was filled with active duty personnel, veterans, and family members, creating an atmosphere of solemn respect and overdue recognition. Secretary Chin's opening remarks acknowledged the systemic failures that had allowed David's heroism to go unrecognized for 5 decades. He spoke about the military's commitment to reviewing historical records and ensuring that other overlooked acts of heroism would not remain hidden. Chin's words were carefully chosen to balance respect for David's sacrifice with acknowledgement of the institutional problems that had delayed this recognition. Colonel Morrison presented the official findings of his investigation, reading excerpts from the witness testimonies and after-action reports that documented David's heroic actions. His presentation was detailed and factual, ensuring that David's story would be preserved in the official record with all the supporting documentation that had been missing from the original reports. When Morrison described the specific moments of David's final battle, the hall fell completely silent. His account of David's deliberate decision to remain in an exposed position, continuing to fire at enemy forces even after being wounded, painted a picture of extraordinary courage and selflessness. Margaret found herself hearing these details for the second time, but they were no less powerful in this formal setting. General Williams was invited to speak about David's character and leadership, sharing personal observations from their service together. Her testimony was particularly moving because it came from someone who had witnessed David's heroism firsthand and had carried the memory of his sacrifice for 50 years. Williams spoke about the burden of survival, the responsibility felt by those whose lives had been saved by another sacrifice. The climax of the ceremony came when Secretary Chun called Margaret forward to receive David's Silver Star on his behalf. As she walked to the podium, Margaret was acutely aware of the significance of this moment. For decades, she had been an invisible widow, forgotten by the military establishment that had sent her husband to war. Now she stood at the center of a ceremony attended by the highest levels of military leadership. The Silver Star citation was read aloud, officially documenting David's heroic actions for the first time in military records. The language was formal and precise, but it could not fully capture the human cost of David's sacrifice or the decades of grief and uncertainty that Margaret had endured while his heroism remained unrecognized. As Secretary Chun placed the medal in Margaret's hands, she thought about all the times over the past 50 years when she had wondered about David's final moments, all the nights when she had grieved not just for his death, but for the apparent meaninglessness of his sacrifice. This ceremony transformed that grief into something else: pride in David's courage, gratitude for the lives he had saved, and a sense of completion that she had never expected to experience. The ceremony concluded with the playing of taps, the same melody that had been played at David's funeral 52 years earlier. But this time, Margaret was not alone in her grief. She was surrounded by the families that existed because of David's sacrifice, by military leaders who had worked to correct a historical injustice, and by fellow veterans who understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. In the months following the Pentagon ceremony, Margaret's life changed in ways she never could have anticipated. The story of David's belated recognition had attracted media attention, and several newspapers and television programs featured articles about the investigation that had uncovered his heroism. These stories sparked broader discussions about overlooked military sacrifices and the importance of preserving accurate historical records. Margaret found herself invited to speak at veteran events and military ceremonies, sharing her story as both a military widow and an advocate for proper recognition of service member sacrifices. Initially reluctant to accept these speaking engagements, she gradually realized that her experience could help other families who might be facing similar struggles with military bureaucracy or historical oversights. Colonel Morrison had continued his investigation beyond David's case, identifying dozens of other instances where heroic actions had been documented but not properly recognized. His work had evolved into a comprehensive review program, with teams of researchers examining military records from multiple conflicts to identify overlooked acts of valor. David's case had become the foundation for a much larger effort to correct historical injustices. Margaret developed close relationships with the surviving members of David's unit and their families. Robert Hayes visited her several times, bringing his wife and adult children to meet the woman whose husband had saved his life. These visits were emotional but healing, allowing Margaret to see the full impact of David's sacrifice in the faces of people whose existence depended on his final act of courage. Marcus Thompson established a scholarship fund in David's honor, providing educational opportunities for children of military families. The scholarship was specifically designed to help children who had lost parents in combat, ensuring that David's legacy would continue to benefit future generations. Margaret was invited to serve on the scholarship committee, giving her a meaningful way to channel her decades of experience helping military families. General Williams, the former medic who had served with David, became one of Margaret's closest friends. Despite the difference in their military ranks, they shared a bond forged by their common experience of David's sacrifice. Williams often visited Margaret in Washington, and they would spend hours talking about David, the war, and the long journey toward recognition of his heroism. The Pentagon ceremony had also led to the creation of a permanent display honoring David and other overlooked heroes from the Vietnam era. The display, located in the Pentagon's main corridor, featured photographs, documents, and personal artifacts that told the stories of service members whose heroism had been delayed in receiving recognition. Margaret contributed David's military photograph and some of his personal letters for the display. Margaret's own story of resilience and service had also gained recognition. Several veteran organizations honored her for her decades of volunteer work with military widows, acknowledging that her quiet contributions had helped hundreds of families navigate the challenges of military loss. These recognitions meant as much to Margaret as David's Silver Star, validating her own service to the military community. The investigation into David's case had also revealed the broader context of his sacrifice. Researchers discovered that the patrol during which David died had been part of a larger strategic operation that had prevented a significant enemy offensive. David's actions had not only saved the lives of his immediate squad members, but had contributed to a tactical victory that protected countless other American and South Vietnamese forces. Margaret learned that several of the men David had saved had gone on to distinguished military careers. One had become a general, another a Medal of Honor recipient in a later conflict, and others had served with honor in various capacities. David's sacrifice had preserved not just individual lives, but military expertise and leadership that had benefited the entire armed forces for decades. As Margaret approached her 80th birthday, she reflected on the unexpected turn her life had taken. For most of her adult life, she had been defined by loss, by the absence of the husband who had died so young in a distant war. But the discovery and recognition of David's heroism had transformed her identity from forgotten widow to honored military family member, from invisible mourner to respected advocate. The annual ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery had become particularly meaningful to Margaret. Each Memorial Day, she would visit David's grave, now marked with a new headstone that included his Silver Star designation. But more importantly, she had established a tradition of reaching out to other military widows at the cemetery, offering the same comfort and understanding that she wished someone had provided to her decades earlier. Colonel Morrison, who had been promoted to general in recognition of his historical research work, remained a close friend and advocate. He often spoke about David's case as the turning point in his own career, the investigation that had taught him about the human cost of bureaucratic oversights, and the importance of preserving accurate military history. The final validation of Margaret's journey came when the Department of Defense invited her to serve on a permanent committee tasked with reviewing historical military records for potential oversights. This appointment recognized her unique perspective as someone who had lived the consequences of institutional failures while maintaining faith in the military's ultimate commitment to honor and recognition. Margaret accepted this appointment with pride, understanding that her role would allow her to help ensure that other families would not have to wait 50 years for recognition of their loved ones' sacrifices. Her experience with David's case had taught her that persistence, combined with the dedication of people like Colonel Morrison, could eventually overcome even the most entrenched bureaucratic obstacles. As she sat in her small apartment, surrounded by the medals, certificates, and photographs that now documented both David's heroism and her own contributions to the military community, Margaret realized that their story had come full circle. What had begun as a tragedy of overlooked sacrifice had become a testament to the power of truth, persistence, and the bonds that connect military families across generations. David's Silver Star sat in a place of honor on Margaret's mantelpiece, but it was surrounded by photographs of the children and grandchildren of the men he had saved, letters from families he had never met, but whose lives he had made possible, and awards recognizing Margaret's own service to the military community. Together, these mementos told a complete story of sacrifice, recognition, and the enduring impact of heroism that transcends the boundaries of time and bureaucracy. The woman who had once stood overlooked at a cemetery, forgotten by the military establishment she had served, had become a respected voice in that same establishment, ensuring that other stories like David's would not remain hidden in dusty files and forgotten records. Her transformation from invisible widow to honored advocate proved that recognition, while sometimes delayed, could ultimately triumph over institutional neglect and historical oversight.